Hi students, so in this video we're going to talk about creating a perfect square trinomial. And then afterwards I will do one example of solving a quadratic by completing the square. So there are two different forms for the perfect square trinomial. This one here, all the terms are positive, and when you factor it, you end up getting a plus b squared. If you were to FOIL this back out, you would end up getting a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Okay? This one over here, the only difference is the middle term is negative. Okay, so when you factor that, you're going to have a minus b squared. So these are perfect square trinomials, and what we're trying to do here is create a perfect square trinomial. And so what we need to do is look at this middle term right here. These are the middle terms, okay? Recall that in a quadratic you have ax squared plus bx plus c. So we're looking at the middle term, and that one has the b as the coefficient. When we complete the square, what we do is we want to take b and divide it by 2 and square it. That's going to be the number that's going to be added to both sides of the equation when you solve it. Or if you're just trying to complete the square, in this case, that's just the number we're going to add to complete the square to create that perfect square trinomial. So if we look at this, if we follow this rule here, we would take 10, that's b, so 10 divided by 2 and square it. So 10 divided by 2 is 5. 5 squared is 25. So that would be the number that would complete the square. It would create a perfect square trinomial. And then think about how to factor that. If I were to factor this, I would think, what number squared gives me 25, but when I double it, gives me 10. Okay? And that number is 5 basically. 5 squared is 25, and 5 times 2 is 10. So we would be writing it like this. Okay? It would be x plus 5 times x plus 5. And then you'd be able to just write that as x plus 5 squared. So notice that's of this form right here. Okay? So x plus 5 squared. Okay, notice also, look at 10 divided by 2. Remember, that was 5, and that was what was being squared. That matches the sign, and the number matches with what we wrote right here when we factored it. Let's try another one. So on this one, we're going to take negative 8, that's the b value, divide it by 2, and square it. So notice, negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, and then you would square that. Negative 4 squared is negative 4 times negative 4, which is 16, positive 16. So you're always going to be adding when you create the perfect square trinomial, okay? But when you factor it, notice this is the number right here that we're actually going to use when we factor this thing. This is going to factor to x minus 4 times x minus 4, and you can write that as x minus 4 squared. Okay? If you were to FOIL that back out, you would get this. And if you were to FOIL this back out, you would get this. Okay? So that's how you create a perfect square trinomial. I'm going to look at one example where you solve an equation by completing the square. Okay? And this one is written a little bit oddly. So notice this is written a little bit oddly. So what we're going to have to do is remember, we want to get from the previous video I was mentioning to you that you want to get the x squared term and the middle term, the one with the x, on one side, on the left side. You can actually leave this on the right side. Okay? So if we do that, So we're going to subtract 5x from both sides, and we're going to get x squared minus 5x. And then remember, we're trying to create that perfect square trinomial, so we are going to say plus blank equals, and then this is negative 5 plus that same number. So now we have to complete the square, and unfortunately this middle number is an odd number, but that's okay because we know how to work with fractions even though they're not fun. We know how to do that. So remember, in order to create a perfect square trinomial, you have to take this value, so negative 5, so that's b, negative 5 divided by 2, okay, and square it. This actually doesn't simplify, so when we end up factoring, we can actually write it with this number. So again, if we square this, that ends up being negative 5 times negative 5 is 25. So we'll have 25, and 2 times 2 is 4. So that's 25/4 that I have to add to both sides. Okay? And again, remember, when I factor this, I'm going to factor this as x, and then I'm going to use this minus 5/2 and write it squared. And then on this one, I just have to get a common denominator here. So common denominator would be 4, and when I give this, right now it's negative 5 over 1. If I make this 4 on the bottom, I'd have to multiply this by 4. Okay, so think about negative 5 over 1. If I want it to be a 4 on the bottom, I have to multiply the top and the bottom by 4. So that's negative 20 plus 25. So we got negative 20 over 4 plus 25 over 4. And when we simplify that, so I'll rewrite the left side. When we simplify this, we end up with 5 over 4, because a negative 20 plus 25 is positive 5, and we still have it over 4. Okay, we're almost done. Remember, in this form, when we get it in this form, we take the square root of both sides. So we're going to square root the left side, square root the right side. And again, this square and square root undo each other. We have x minus 5 over 2 equals the square root of 5. I can't take that, okay? I'm going to have to just leave it as the square root of 5, but I can take the square root of 4, right? And remember, we're going to have plus and minus here. So we're going to have x minus 5/2 equal to plus or minus, and again, you're going to have to leave the 5 under the square root, but the square root of 4 is 2. So now we have this, and the very final step is adding the 5/2 to the other side. And then you end up with x equals, and I usually write this number first, 5/2 plus or minus root 5 over 2. Whew, you did a good job, okay? Maybe what you can do is, just for an extra example, see if you can solve this problem on your own using the same work that we did, okay? And I'll see you in the next video.